Welcome everyone to the Myth Salon. My name is Dana White, and together with my good friend and colleague, Will Lin, we are the hosts of the Myth Salon. And today we have an extra special treat of having two presenters. We have Dr. Zaman Stanizai and Dr. Connie Zweig. However, as I am wont to do right now, I really want to give a moment of silence after I do the singing bowl for the difficult situation we are in related to the coronavirus. We are above 5 million cases in the United States, 160,000 plus deaths. Each of these people is a person in somebody's life. So I would like to call up the singing bowl, and I'd like to give these people a moment of silence before we begin. Thank you all. Ever since we started the Myth Salon, I've wanted to do an evening devoted to Rumi. In fact, at the very beginning, when Zaman came out and we did a making sense of the Middle East, it really called to me that Rumi is a deep spirit that has survived through history and time and across cultures since the 13th century. So I want to read a little compilation. You were born with wings. Why prefer to crawl through life? The right mental attitude, the trained mind will bring you the best there is in the universe. Raise your words, not your voice. It is the rain that grows flowers, not thunder. Yet words are merely a pretext. It is the inner world you love that draws us together. Wherever you are, whatever you do, be love. Love is the bridge between you and everything. Keep breaking your heart until it opens. The wound is the place where light enters. Your heart is an ocean. Find yourself in the depths. Whatever you love, you are. So close your eyes. Fall in love. Now, stay there. So, welcome everyone. What a beautiful, wonderful day we have. And it just seems incongruous with all that's happening around us. But here we are together in a community. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Will Lin, and let him introduce our first speaker, Dr. Zaman Stanizai. And let's go forward and enjoy the evening together. Will?
Thank you, Dana, and thank you for the moment of silence. Some of you know that my dad had a 102-degree temperature for a couple of days last week. He's in his 70s, and took a while for that test to come back and to get some relief. And it doesn't come back, negative for everybody. So it's, very intense, and thank you. And it's great to see some people again out there that I saw this last weekend at the Mythologium, Fates and Graces. We saw some of our good friends from the Myth Salon there, John Booker, Bradley Olson, Corinne Bordeaux. Really, really enjoyed it, and had a great time. Hope everybody will check it out. I think they'll probably be releasing some videos of their event later, and especially enjoyed the last day. Some of you noticed that we have started putting out some newsletters. you know, we've been trying to get our act together slowly and surely. It's been some years, and our goal this time was just to kind of get everything working. Facebook pages, Instagram, YouTube, just connected, just functioning. And but they are all functioning now. And I want to thank AJ Minter for doing an incredible, sorry, AJ Floridas for doing an incredible amount of work for us to get this done. So thank you, AJ. And hopefully if you're on any of those platforms, you'll check us out or check the links when they come through in an email. And if you're not getting an email, let us know. We have some really exciting stuff to announce, some collaborations, some guests, and I hope you'll keep your eyes open for those. And I hope I hope you got that first newsletter that we sent last week, which was mostly about thanking these panelists, our guests. It also included a moment of silence for COVID and a letter on systemic racism that you're invited to sign. If any of you are still interested, I know they're still interested in those signatures. Thank you again to Odette for sharing that with us. And it's from this theme of thanks that I'd like to welcome our guests. First, Connie Zweig. You are a world-renowned author and psychologist who does incredible work with the shadow. You're working with us for whatever that means. Everybody doesn't know, and I want them to know how much thanks we owe you for helping us bring together an incredible group of guests on the horizon. So thank you, and thank you for your warm and kind enthusiasm that's kept us going. And Zaman Stanizai, Pacifica faculty member, Fulbright scholar, political scientist, Sufi mystic, poet, person who cares with a smiling heart. Your participation and support of this group in all kinds of ways since its beginning has meant the world and has helped make this world. So thank you. It's a really special night to bring you two together to talk about Rumi. And with that, I just want to invite and welcome our panel in. Dennis Slattery, who's been doing this Creative Encounter series. We've got an event coming up next week. I hope you'll check it out, and previous videos as well. An author, scholar, poet, and longtime faculty member at Pacifica. Boris Nunley, an author and professor, scholar, teaches at UC Riverside philosophy. Selena Matthews, an author and clinical depth psychologist and a longtime friend of the Myth Salon. And Dana White, of course, you know, our host. So thank you all. As always, I look forward to our rich discussion tonight. And with that, we'll hand it over to Zaman, who I understand will go for a little bit here, and then hand it over to Connie, and then we'll do our normal thing. So thank you, everybody.
That was a beautiful silence we started with, and fortunately we had to break it up with the noise. Silence is Rumi's pen name in his poetry. That he doesn't use very often, and not too many people know, because he instead uses Shams's name as his pen name. But that's a whole other story. Rumi, as he's known in the West, is Jalaluddin Muhammad Balkhi. Balkh is the city in Afghanistan where he was born, or it's in its vicinity. And usually people used in those times their city location as their last name. So you would have people like Shirazi from Shiraz, and Tusi and Dehlavi and so on. So what eventually became known as the last name, family name, was actually the name of the location of the person. I think some Florentine and Da Vinci and some variations of that may have begun in Europe too. He was born in 1207 in a family of scholars. His father was a jurist and a theologian who had his own school, and he was a judge for a time. So sometimes having that kind of a rich environment kind of affects you from early on. So in my opinion, Rumi did not have much of a childhood. As he had to model his father, and then he had a teacher by the name of Tirmizi, who would undertake his formal tutoring, teaching. And then from early on, he also happened to be looking up to two role models whose books and writings he was familiar with. One was Sanai of Ghazni, Sanai Ghaznavi, again, city last name, and Attar Neshapuri. By the time, I mean, even before he was a teenager, he was immersed in a whole lot of knowledge that went beyond the literacy and the formal education. And he was constantly challenged. That's why, as I said, he may have been a grown-up in a little boy's body very early on. The way I would describe his life in total is that it's a kind of a sequential transition. I think there is a Chinese saying that may you live in interesting times. I think his life was like that, that by the time he lived a particular life for a few years, things changed completely. In other words, nature, the environment, events, political and otherwise, did not allow for him to get bored with something. And so, as I said, his early childhood would have been most of that education, and people like Sanai and Attar would have been names, characters in the books that he studied. But then came the threat from the north that the Mongols were invading, and they had to, in essence, run for their life, become refugees. Most of the invasions in Afghanistan happened from the north. And so this one was also from the north, so they had to go south. And when his father was traveling from one city to the next, being a great scholar himself, he always sought these great men in the various towns and cities that he visited. And obviously, Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi, the child, would have been accompanying his father. So when they arrived in Nishapur, they met Attar, and Rumi had studied his books and his ideas, just like, you know, that would have been a great opportunity for him to meet the person whose thoughts he was familiar with. But in a way, the surprise was on both sides, because Attar was so impressed by Rumi, by this little child. Well, he knew his father was a great man, but he was impressed by the little child. And as they were leaving his prison, whether it was school courtyard or whatever, it is reported that Attar had made a comment saying that this is like an ocean following a pond. That the ocean was the son and the pond was the father. Quite a compliment. And he also gave a gift of one of his books to Rumi as a personal gift, like, you know, autographed, the equivalent of that. And so as Rumi was going from, you know, riding on the back of a camel, whatever caravan there was, headed south, of course, they had to use the pretext of going on Hajj pilgrimage so that they will not, you know, create any kind of stirring, political or otherwise. So they were supposedly going on a Hajj. And Rumi was reading Attar's book on the back of a camel, looking all around. There's a flat desert, there's nothing to see. And everything that meant was right here in the pages of this book. So they had similar visits in every town and city where they met the great scholars, the great mystics. They went and made Hajj in Arabia, came back to Baghdad, and Baghdad was the capital of the, that was the hub of the world in a way. It was the height of the Islamic civilization at the time. But somehow they were not impressed by Baghdad. Perhaps there was, it was too metropolitan, maybe there was too much corruption, a lot of things didn't live up to their names as they were expecting. So they went further west to Damascus, and from Damascus went further north to Aleppo, and they ended up in Anatolia. And that's when Kayqubad, the ruler of Konya, invited Baha'u'llah, Rumi's father, told him that we know what had happened to your country, and we would like to invite you. He invited him over to Konya, and in Konya, he was given everything he wanted. He opened his own school again, and life was as normal as it could have been. But as the reports came to them from Central Asia, from Afghanistan, and they heard that the beautiful paradise they had left behind is all gone, everything is destroyed, and cities and towns have been burned. And so this gave Rumi an idea of the transient nature, the temporal nature of the world, that things cannot stay like that forever. He was only a teenager at the time, and he got married to one of the girls who came with them from their village. And at one point, his former teacher from Balkh came and found them. And Baha'u'llah told him, look, your student is here, so yeah, you can relax for a few days, but after that, I want you to start teaching him. And after a few days of teaching, Tirmizi, his teacher, came to Rumi's father. He said, I can't teach this kid anything anymore. I open my mouth and he already knows it. So we better not waste his time. He better go to another school. Well, where to? So the final agreement was made that he should go to Aleppo, to Syria, which would have been just south of Anatolia, of course. So Rumi went there, and the tradition in Syria, or whatever it may have been called at that time, the cities like Aleppo and Damascus and the other cities, was that they had these great universities, and students will do their studies in the morning, and in the late afternoon, they will come out and they will be having these town squares where a particular scholar in training will stand on a stump and present a theory or explain a theory, and people will come and ask questions. And so they didn't have any other sort of entertainment. So this was the intellectual entertainment they had. And so it is, well, let me continue with that previous story. So he goes back to Anatolia, to Konya. And when he's 24, he takes over his father's university because his father dies at this time. And so he has mastered all the sciences of his time at the age of 17. That would have been the equivalent of a PhD for our times. Everything that was there in formal education, and everything that he learned after the age 17 was on his own. And that continued until he was about 38. And then he was not only known as a great jurist, as a theologian, but he was in great demand. Rulers and kings would invite him over, for retreats and all that. And then when he was 38, one day he was leaving his university, his madrasa, and he was going home, going through the main street of Konya, when somehow this wanderer broke through the security ring that was around his entourage and came over and grabbed Rumi's, the horse's harness, and bluntly asked him a question. And while the people in the entourage for Rumi's security was kind of nervous that how come this happened and where did this man came from, Rumi told them to keep their distance, and that's okay. And he asked Rumi a question, and Rumi gave him an answer. The answer was easy. The explanation was what impressed Shams. And so Rumi got off his horse, and the two were staring at one another, looking at one another, talking and listening, and understood each other like they knew that they were both thirsting for someone to listen to the ideas they had. And from there, they went to Rumi's place, and Rumi, who had schools and the seminary students and all that, he abandoned everything, and he spent all his time with Shams. The first time, immediately, they were for 16 days, they did not leave the guest house. And so they were talking and talking, and that was a time when basically Shams introduced him to a new world, to a new idea. And I think, like I said earlier, that it was kind of a sequential kind of a recurrence, but you could say that there was a reset button. So the reset button was pushed one more time, and Rumi just went to a totally different world. So everything he knew, whatever he was, all of that was just pushed aside. And Shams asked him questions and gave him condition and told him if he really wanted to follow him. And whatever condition he put forward, Rumi accepted them. And so from then on, then Rumi became the man we know today, which is he switched from a jurist, from a theologian, a person who had done a whole lot of scholarship and everything. He put that aside. And some of the stories goes that immediately on that first visit, when Rumi told Shams that, okay, you stay here, I'm gonna go bring you some tea, or I don't know if they had coffee. And Rumi wanted to do this to honor him. He would have had servants or someone else to do that, but Rumi did it himself. So when Rumi comes back, he finds that half of his books are thrown in the little reflective pool they had. And Rumi looks at his book, that, his most valuable, his greatest treasure, his books, the things that he studied, that he was teaching from, they are thrown in the water. And he was kind of puzzled, didn't know what to do with this guest who is so kind of blunt in a way. And Shams understood and told him, you don't need those books anymore. And so that's where the whole thing begins. And the way I look at this is that I think Shams was a wanderer. He didn't have much formal schooling, because in terms of his etiquette and his manners, he was pretty much intolerable, that he didn't last very long, whichever school, whichever madrasa, whichever place he went to. The meeting of the two, I would equate to that of, I will equate the two of them, not actually the meeting, to Socrates and Plato. The only difference is that Socrates and Plato were in the same city, but Rumi and Shams were not. Shams was so frustrated that the things he knew and he could talk about, he was not being understood, and that was his major frustration. Rumi had learned and all the things that he needed to. It was more conventional education. And as such, he was a good teacher. He could explain. He could be understood. He was tolerant. He was loquacious. He was good in those terms. But then his frustration at that point was that there was not much more to do. So everything he needed, he had studied, but then he needed for his own development something more. And so it was this thirsting of both of them for a different level. It is said that when Rumi used to lecture in those town squares in Aleppo in Syria, that Shams had come several times to those gatherings and was watching and listening this young man from a distance, but he dare not get any closer because he was afraid that he might get disappointed. He was very impressed. And he would do that, but he will not introduce himself. He will not interrupt or anything. And so when he came to Konya, Shams knew who Rumi was, but Rumi had no idea who Shams was. And so the visit of the two, or the presence of the two, resulted in kinds of jealousies and nervousness and, the school being closed, not because of the coronavirus, but because there was, Rumi just said, forget it, whatever you guys want to study, do it on your own. I don't have time anymore. He probably didn't even go to the mosque for the prayer. They prayed together. And so this attachment, this gravitational force was so powerful that neither one of them had time for anyone or anything else. So that is, in a nutshell, what I can say about Rumi, and I could answer questions if there are any. I doubt that there will be any, but let me stop here.
Thank you, Zaman. And would we like to proceed? I mean, incredible history of Rumi's life, and I wonder, would we like to respond to this, or would we like Connie to continue and for us to all respond together?
I think Connie can go ahead and present, and then we will deal with the questions afterwards.
Okay.
For those of you who've read Rumi's poetry, you must have loved these anecdotal details that Zaman gave us, because they're so specific, and I was seeing things, and I was right there in the story, and you kind of transported me into the story. And I'm assuming that some of you are wondering why I'm talking about Rumi. Who am I to do that? And so you may not know that I wrote a novel called A Moth to the Flame, which is the life story of Rumi. And I'll tell you a little bit about how that happened, because unlike Zaman, I'm not an expert. I didn't grow up in Islam. I'm not a scholar of Islam. I'm not a scholar of Sufism, but this is how my life unfolded. So I want to begin with a quote from Yeats. There's but one history, and that is the soul's. And if we look deeply enough beyond the surface, beyond the personal story, to the archetypal or the mythic story of Rumi or of ourselves, we see something universal. We see the story of the human soul, the one story, as Yeats said. And we tend to see this most easily in the life stories of saints and sages, whose lives point to the soul's search for the divine, and its yearning for the gods, its longing for heaven. In the book that I wrote called Meeting the Shadow of Spirituality, which is about the soul's holy longing for something transcendent, or the lover's longing for the beloved, I suggested that this universal yearning lies hidden as the source of all of our life stories. In some people, this longing is awakened. In some people, it's not. But I suggest that this is a quality of soul that we all share as human beings. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, as I told Zaman, I was immersed in the poetry of Rumi. I was reading Coleman Barks, but I was also reading other translations, and I was really steeped in it. And I began to have a series of dreams of Rumi. This completely foreign figure in a turban and a gown, strolling along unknown roads and telling me a tale night after night. I didn't know what to do. I started to write down the dreams. I said to my husband, Neil, who's listening here, I can't write about this. What is this? I mean, why is this happening? And then I realized that Rumi was driven by holy longing, just as I was. And I recognized his yearning as my own. And after that, a book began to take shape. There was a whole series of synchronicities around this book. A translator appeared, and we went and looked at all these books in Farsi. And it turned out that the story I was dreaming was the story in all these biographies that Zaman just told us. And eventually I could see that the key mythic moments in Rumi's life were the same as the mythic moments in my own and in yours. These are the moments that make up the one history, the soul's history. And this was Joseph Campbell's great insight, you know, that all of our journeys are the hero's journeys. And his framework helped me to see how Rumi's life, like the life of Jesus or Siddhartha or the Buddha, Saint Teresa, Shankara, Odysseus, or even Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, all fit into this pattern. And my guess is so does yours. But we just haven't had this lens to look at our own life stories in this way. Some of us have had it. We had that beautiful Myth Salon with Chris Vogler here about the hero's journey through the pandemic. So some of us have had this. But what happened for me is I started to think about writing the story of a 13th century Muslim sheikh, you know, as a postmodern, post-feminist, white female, you know, from Western culture. I realized that I had these two entry points to his inner world. One was his yearning for the divine, and which I shared. And the other was the mythic lens on his journey. So the job I'm giving myself with you tonight is to look at Rumi's life story, as we just heard it from Zaman, as a reflection of your own life, as a way to help you see beyond your personal story and your personal suffering to a more universal tale, and perhaps to your soul's purpose. And in addition, you can look for the archetypal figures that appear in every myth as we go through this. The hero, teacher, mentor, magician, lover, guardian, shadow, trickster, warrior. These universal figures appear at key moments in our stories, as when the hero encounters the dragon, or the prince rescues the princess, or the wise man guides the traveler. And some of you probably have read Romancing the Shadow, and you might recall that I found my life story in the myth of Athena, the Greek virgin goddess warrior. Or rather, I found Athena in my life story. And that discovery radically altered my understanding of my own journey. And it aroused in me a desire for a whole new life direction. And in the same way, I found my life story in the pattern of Rumi's journey. It's pretty strange. I get that if you're not used to thinking this way, because we're so focused on individuality. But there's something larger living in us at every moment, I believe. So, homage to Campbell and Jung and Vogler, we can begin to see through the cultural differences, through the individual differences, to the universal patterns, and to the archetypes that live just behind or beyond our stories. And as Jung put it, the archetypes are not in us. We are in the archetypes. So to glimpse them, to look beyond ourselves to something larger, that's our intention here together. And here's how I want to do this for the next 20, 30 minutes. As we go through this time, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to tell Rumi's story from the point of view of the hero's journey. I'm going to leave out a lot of the facts that we learned from Zaman. And then I'm going to pause at each stage of the journey so that you can reflect on your own parallel moment, the mythic moment that I'm talking about in your own life. And if you want, because we don't have a lot of time, so if you want to, you might take some notes in case you want to go back to it. So it's kind of an interactive, contemplative process that we're going to go on together. So, original world, you know, where the journey begins. And Zaman described that in great detail for us. In 1207, Rumi was born in Afghanistan, and he was born in a region where Muslims and Christians and Jews actually lived together in cooperation. And then in 1215, the Mongol invaders began to arrive and wreak havoc. And the family went into exile. I think they wandered for 7 or 8 years. Is that right, Zaman? 7 or 8 years, yeah. So exile, mythic theme, right? Very young boy, appeared to have a stable family life. And this terrible thing happens, this crisis happens, and they're in exile. And so he knew homelessness. And perhaps the seeds of longing for home were planted then. And that actually appeared later in his poetry, the longing for home. Okay, so as we learned, the family settled in South Central Turkey, and Rumi married Goher and had 2 sons. And so if we look at the situation from the outside with our ordinary lens, he's a guy who had it all, as we like to say today. Okay, so here are a couple of questions for you. What were the formative circumstances of your early life? What were the personal conditions and the larger cultural conditions? And what stirred you to seek something more? What about your situation might have aroused that longing? And on the other hand, what about the situation put you to sleep, like Sleeping Beauty? Okay, the next mythic moment, disillusionment and the call. So Rumi lived a dutiful life, and as we heard from Zaman, his father was a scholar and a sheikh, and everyone assumed that Rumi would step into his position. It was kind of a given, right? It was a lineage. And he obeyed the moral code of his religious order. And what started to happen, and he became a man of learning. We've got some beautiful details about that. And then his mother died. and then his father grew ill. And when his father died and Rumi assumed the position of the sheikh, he began to lead the community. And in our language, we would say, as he took the name Rumi, because that was when he took that name, he began to carry the projection. He began to carry the projection of the leadership, religious leadership, moral leadership, scholarly leadership. But I think there was another part of him that saw through this, that saw through it all. He saw that the power and the stature were temporary. And he knew from his early experience that, as Zaman pointed out, that our situations are temporary, they're fleeting. He also saw that marriage was not an answer for him. And when Gohar died, his young wife died, he knew for certain that death would come. So he began to ask more urgently what really mattered, what really called to him beyond ordinary life. So when did you become disillusioned with your stable, what we call normal life? When did you begin to feel a conflict between your outer duty and demands and your inner desire or temperament? I can put this into the chat later. So when did you feel a conflict between duty and desire? What awakened your longing? What temptations did you face to support the status quo? They could be financial or familial or religious. So did you heed the call? And what were the consequences if you did heed the call or did not? Okay, so the next mythic moment, I think probably some of you were in Dennis's talk about Dante, where he spoke of the Beatrician moment. The moment when Dante sees Beatrice and his entire life trajectory changes. So this is Rumi's Beatrician moment. This is exactly what happens to him. And I'm just going to read you the way that I wrote about it. I hope you don't mind a brief reading. And we heard this moment from Zaman. So here it is in fictionalized form. The desert dervish appears out of nowhere. Rumi's transfixed by his sudden dreamlike appearance. Emaciated as a reed and covered with road dust, the man's head and eyebrows are shaven clean. Draped in an old black cloak, wearing a strange pointed hat, he carries himself like a biblical prophet, like Moses himself, with a massive wooden staff which he places upright on the ground between them. Without warning, the dervish grabs the reins of his donkey and the animal startles, jostling him. His hawk eyes seem to search his own like prey. The stranger lifts his staff and steps closer as Rumi feels rising trepidation. His neck outstretched, the dervish shouts at him, "Who was greater, the Prophet Muhammad or?" Muhammad was the ocean itself. Alhamdulillah, praise God, the dervish's piercing cry splits the air. Suddenly, Rumi slips down from the donkey, falling onto his back with a thud. He gazes up at feathery wisps of white floating freely, dissolving into blue. His body seems to float up, and the men below recede into miniature. The trees vanish. He enters a wide open space in which the air is spinning about him, sweeping him up, turning him like a gnat inside the wind. Arms outstretched, he lets go and becomes the whirling, forgetting where he is and who he is. Rising higher, becoming cloud, then air, then nothing, yet everything. a wind through all things, a whiff of wisteria. He feels a sensation between the eyebrows, the touch of wood. His body jolts against the ground. A blazing heat goes up his back into his chest and bursts into a white light in his forehead. Moments later, his neck itches against pebbles. Fana, I dissolved in Fana, like the clouds. Fana, ego annihilation or transcendence. Rumi lifts his head off the ground and the stranger towers above him, bright sparks flickering through him. He recognizes the man, although he's never seen him before. He reaches out his arms and whispers to no one in particular, "The God that I have worshipped all my life appears to me today in human form." So, the Bedristian moment, meeting the beloved. As far as we know, Rumi didn't imagine a future different from the one that was set out for him. He didn't have the kinds of opportunities and choices that we have today, but the events of his life were ripening him, opening him up to change. And if he had remained attached to the old ways, desiring only to live his father's pattern, he would not have been receptive to what happened next. So how, and again, referring back to Zaman, he changed from a scholar to a lover. He changed from following the path of knowledge to following the path of love. He relinquished his position and his stature and his books. So how has an encounter with an unexpected stranger overturned your world? Who was your Beatrice or your Shams of Tabriz? Did he or she feel like an intruder or an answer to a prayer? How do you believe this moment required you to change? Did you resist or surrender? What needed to be shattered for you to open? Okay, so the next mythic moment. And those of you who know Campbell know this well. Tests, allies, and enemies. So the beloved typically tests the lover. And Shams tests Rumi's obedience in many ways. He undergoes each ordeal by saying yes, as Zaman put it. And what happened was people around them took sides. And as that happened, the archetypes became more visible. For example, Rumi's oldest son, Sultan Balad, became his greatest ally, and he began to protect the new order that was emerging. Whereas Alauddin, the younger son, felt abandoned and enraged, and he stood for the old ways, becoming more rigid. And Rumi's second wife and key disciples each have their own response, taking positions in this unfolding drama. So for you, what tests and ordeals did you undergo? How did you respond to them? How did others react to your new behavior or your new values? Parents, children, friends, colleagues. And how did you respond to their reactions? Okay, the next mythic moment. crossing the threshold from the old world to the new world. So to the horror and rage and envy of Rumi's family and his community, Shams moved into Rumi's house. The dutiful father and leader abandoned his duties, and Shams devalued book knowledge, so he abandoned his books. Shams emphasized direct mystical experience via their love and devotion to one another. So he became primary in Rumi's heart. And then they entered long retreats, secluded from the others, in which Shams initiated Rumi into mystical practices of music and dance that broke the rules of the order. So the younger son and the disciples responded with moral outrage and grief over the loss of their father and teacher. And when Rumi told them that now they had to obey Shams, whom they viewed as a heretic, the allies and enemies took clear sides. When Rumi married his young stepdaughter to Shams, they raged. So for you, after meeting the beloved, how did you actually change? What new rules or values replaced the old ones, and what was sacrificed? And what new freedoms were found? Just a couple more minutes here. So the next mythic moment is the ordeal, which we know from all the myths and fairy tales and legends, right? As tempers flared and the community polarized, Rumi knew that Shams was in danger, but he was blinded by love. And then one day Shams disappeared and Rumi burned for his beloved. This separation became his ordeal. His open, broken heart opened further and his holy longing intensified. He saw beyond the emptiness of physical separation from Shams to the utter emptiness of spiritual separation, until his only desire was for higher union. As he longed for Shams, he longed for God. And when he opened his mouth, to his shock, poetic verse flowed out. And the scholar for whom poetry was forbidden became the poet. So how did your beloved person leave, abandon you, or die? Can you make a distinction between the emotional separation and the spiritual separation? Did you leave? Did your longing intensify? And can you imagine it as a longing for a higher union? So the next moment is reunion. In Rumi's case, his son convinced Shams to return. Ecstatic, Rumi experienced deeper states of unity, and the community went into deeper states of rage and loss that their beloved teacher disappeared again. Often we see this pattern in romantic relationships. There's a second reunion, a second separation. How was this different from the first? And how did your community respond? And did you make a bargain to try to make it permanent? Okay, next, the tale has a dramatic conclusion. And I don't know if this is factual or not, Zaman, but according to legend, Alauddin, the younger son, and the disciples murdered Shams. Rumi banished his son and entered an intense mourning period in which he spoke his grief in the poetry that we know so well. So remember, we have several levels of the story here. At the level of the story, the factual story, this is a tragedy and a betrayal of the worst kind. But at the level of the myth, there's something else going on. And the next mythic moment is resurrection. Like Jesus, whose crucifixion led to spiritual rebirth, Rumi died before he died, as the Sufis call this. We would call it ego death. The end of outer attachment to Shams led to the attainment of inner union with the divine. Rumi's suffering was transformed into gold, his creative achievement a beacon to us all 800 years later. And as I sat with the poetry in chronological order, I could see the evolution of his consciousness. I could see the stages through which he transited as he completed the separation and entered the union. So a question for you for this one is, have you found a treasure in the ruin of your loss? And the final mythic moment, the return. So for the hero of myth, there's always a return to the world. Rumi began to teach again from his new level of consciousness, free of the limited identifications and attachments. And of course, to compose ecstatic poetry, his legacy to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for the muted applause, much appreciated.
You know what I want to start doing? I want to start doing raising my hand and lowering my hand. I wonder if Zaman, if you'd like to respond, first to anything that Connie shared.
There are so many beautiful questions. If I have to sit and respond to those, that will take quite some time. But no, as she said, that's a novel, and it's contextualized in a beautiful way. As a novel, it doesn't have to be factual, but it's pretty close. I think it's very nicely done. The questions would be something that people would have to contemplate on in their personal lives for a long while, not necessarily to answer them, in my opinion. It's that they have to be, you have to think them out. You have to feel the question, how does it define your life? How does it contextualize your spiritual life with your everyday environment? I think in that sense, I like the questions very much, but like I said, sometimes a question does not need to be answered to be felt. And I think these were some of those questions, yeah.
I think the way Rilke put it, we live into our questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was really moved by the point you made about kind of distinguishing between the personal and the mythic levels. I find that to be really the case, where something can happen on a personal level that seems incredibly sloppy, hurtful, emotional, not necessarily from, not even something you would admire or something, right? But then on a mythic level, it's so clean and so straightforward with its meaning in your life and the unfolding of your pattern and that kind of stuff. It's really nice to hear that, those two brought up in relation to each other, and it helps to, to remind that even when something is really sloppy on a personal level, look for the elegance, in the mythic pattern of our lives.
Beautifully
I
said.
think there's another way of looking at it is that one of the reasons he's called Rumi is because that part of Anatolia used to be part of the Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire. So Jalaluddin Rumi means Jalaluddin the Greek in essence, because that was a Greek culture. And the Greek culture is a culture of reason and rational thinking. And from the limited understanding I have of the various scriptures, Quran is one that constantly reminds its reader, these are the signs for those who think. And you would think that, wait a minute, if this is scripture, this is the word of God, you know, everything has to be done the way it is said. Rather, the Quran is inviting you to think. So Rumi comes from that, that perspective of rationalism within the Islamic scriptural tradition. Then he comes to the land of the Greeks where rationalism was common. And when all of this kind of holds together, here comes a man who says, yes, it's good to reason, but there's something beyond that. And as many of the the stories that are made about Sufis, they're not necessarily documented truths, but they are made to create, to explain a certain concept. For instance, in one of those stories, Rumi and Shams are walking in the woods, and obviously Shams was in his 60s, probably 70, and, you know, like twice his age. So out of respect for age, Shams is going first, and Rumi is following him. But Rumi notices that Shams is kind of busy in his own world, and he's walking and he's talking, he's saying things, he's not watching where he's going. At least that's what Rumi thought. So Rumi keeps calling him very gently, reminding him like we are headed straight towards a lake, that we have to take either a left or a right to go around it, but we are headed straight. So he says, Shams, and Shams, and Shams doesn't respond. And at one point, when he raises his voice, Shams tells him, like, keep saying that, don't worry. Keep saying Shams. And Rumi notices that Shams is going straight at the lake, and he starts walking on the water. Now, Rumi follows him, and he keeps saying Shams as he was, and they're both walking on the water. And kind of midway through the lake, Rumi notices that Shams is not saying that, so Shams is saying Allah, Allah, Allah. But Rumi is saying Shams, Shams, Shams. So finally, Rumi says, well, if he's saying that, I better say that too. So the minute Rumi says Allah, he sinks down into the water. And Shams turns around and lifts him up, and he says, you know, what did you do? He says, well, you were saying Allah, and so I said Allah too. That's why. He says, no, you're not ready to say Allah. You have to keep saying Shams. I'm ready to say Allah. When you get to my level, then you say what I say. So in that kind of thing, even a person of so much learning, so much understanding, that there's always something beyond the obvious. And so, like I said, the story may not be true, but what it teaches us is very important. But for a lot of us, in many of the sciences we study, the day we get those 2-3 letters after our names, we think we got it.
That's a beautiful story.
Thank you.
Would anybody else from the panel like to share their thoughts or reflections about these two wonderful presentations?
Yeah, I love both of them, and I love the quality of complementarity that that Zaman began with, and then Connie tacked us a little bit in another direction, but still united. And I'm moved to read a Rumi poem if Connie and Zaman are okay with that.
Sure.
Because it really does fit into what both of you have then I'm going to use Rumi's word, unfolding for us. And this is a popular poem of his, but there may be folks who have never heard it. And it's entitled, Unfold Your Own Myth. Who gets up early to discover the moment that light begins? Who finds us here, circling, bewildered, like atoms? Who comes to a spring thirsty and sees the moon reflected in it? Who, like Jacob, blind with grief and age, smells the shirt of his lost son and can see again? Who lets a bucket down and brings up a flowing prophet? Or like Moses, goes for fire and finds what burns inside the sunrise? Jesus slips into a house to escape enemies and opens a door to the other world. Solomon cuts open a fish and there's a gold ring. Omar storms in to kill the prophet and leaves with blessings. Chase a deer and end up everywhere. An oyster opens his mouth to swallow one drop. Now there's a pearl. A vagrant wanders empty ruins. Suddenly, he's wealthy. But don't be satisfied with stories, how things have gone with others. Unfold your own myth without complicated explanations, so everyone will understand the passage, we have opened you. Start walking toward Shams. Your legs, I beg your pardon, your legs will get heavy and tired. Then comes a moment of feeling the wings you've grown lifting. So the poem just felt really appropriate at this moment, that helped me further congeal both Zaman and Connie's presentations. So thank you for letting me read this.
That was perfect, Dennis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, incredible poetry, and thank you also, Dana, for opening with the poem. We could spend a whole myth salon unpacking one of his poems, one line from one of his poems. Zaman, was it you that told me that he spent a certain few years writing his poems and then 10 times as many years trying to explain them to people or writing about their explanations?
As Connie was saying earlier, he was a man who, if not resented poetry, was very dismissive of it. The need for poetry became a common thing in Muslim world for two reasons. One, when Hallaj was taken to the gallows for telling the truth, I am the truth, then the mystics were in trouble. So they started writing poetry to express their thoughts. And when they would get in trouble, they would say, look, I'm in love with a human being, so these are love poems. But they had this double entendre that at the same time, the beloved could have been the divine or it could have been a human. Later on, scholars found writing in verse useful because it prevented or at least limited plagiarism on their work. So since each scholar had his own style of poetry, then they would rhyme their ideas, and that way it will be difficult and people will not be able to add a verse here or a sentence there, since they didn't have print, they didn't have the press, so they were all handwritten. Well, Rumi was one of those who didn't like poetry, but once Shams left, Person in love, he went crazy. And when they finally brought him the news that he has been, quote unquote, sighted in Damascus, he sent his son to bring him back, but along with several poems that he probably on the spot wrote for him. And in one of those poems, he says that what you have done to me was impossible. I was an ordinary person with my prayer rug. I was the judge. I was this and that. And you made me a lover, and I even write poetry right now. But I think that the best of his poetry would be the spiritual couplets, which is one of the world's longest poems, over 25,000 verses. And it starts with verses that are called Nainama, or the call of the reed flute, and a shorter version, an abbreviated version of it reads like this. This is by Nicholson, 1950. Hearken to this reed forlorn, breathing ever since 'twas torn from its rushy bed, a strain of impassioned love and pain. The secret of my song, though near, none can see and none can hear. Oh, of a friend to know the sign and mingle all his soul with mine. 'Tis the flame of love that fired me. 'Tis the wine of love inspired me. Wouldst thou learn how lovers bleed? Hearken, hearken to the reed. Here, there is a very significant metaphor he uses. He compares the reed flute to a human being. And he considers himself being that flute on the lips of the divine. That when the divine message comes through, as we read in Quranic and scriptural, in biblical verses, God breathed into the body of Adam, that breath. And so it's that breath that runs through our body and makes us sing, I think I can say the word, that it's the divine speaking through us. There's the divine within, and it comes out, and it's the music, it's the tone. It doesn't have to be words, because words are relative. There's cultural relativism, and there is the interpretation of it. And so therefore words may not carry. But remember that one of the pen names Rumi uses is silence. And in that silence, I think that often he tries, as a good teacher that he was, he tries to explain and explain and explain, and at the end he feels so frustrated. So he's basically telling himself to be quiet. It's not words that will convey the meaning. It's the silence that you feel and experience afterwards. So that the reed flute is that we humans are like a flute. And if you are in love, the breath that blows through the flute gives the message of love. Otherwise, you're simply breathing like any other living being. So whether you live at the worldly level, I think I should explain the word that we have in the Islamic culture. Well, in the Greek culture, in the Western culture, you talk about the physical and the metaphysical. And in a way, it is still physics-centered. So that physical is the reality, the metaphysical is other than this reality. Whereas the Islamic words would be the world of the physical world, which is the physical, but then the other one is not related to the first one. It's called the world of the meaning, where things have meaning, the archetypal level. And I think what Shams did to Rumi is like, yes, you live in the sense world. Everything makes sense if you depend on the senses, but you should know that senses are not everything. So senses don't make sense, if you know what I'm saying. So then you have to go beyond that to the world of meaning, where things become meaningful. And in the world of meaning, there is no sound, there are no words. That's the archetypal level where things, it become meaningful because you find a central point around which you could spin around. The whirling dervish, that central point is the same, but the experience at which everyone will have a different experience spinning around. They have to find their own circle of nothingness in the middle, where you become your everything physical of you becomes nothing in that center, in that black hole.
When I was in the midst of all this, I dragged my husband to Konya so we could study with Jalaluddin Loris. There are two people who claim the lineage of Mevlana Rumi, and he was one of them. And so we learned the sema, the turn that you're describing. It was very difficult. Neil was much better at it than I was. But there's a sense of that deep mystical practice in that dance, and the sense of loosening and letting go and finding the center, and kind of just what you're describing. You transcend the physical, and you transcend a sort of a focused awareness. And I'm wondering, Zaman, if you know anything about, did that tradition, well, let me step back for a minute. My understanding is that in many religious traditions, there are these two streams of sort of the scholarly, intellectual, and can be more orthodox, and the mystical, intoxicated, ecstatic stream. Like in Judaism, the Hasidim are like the Sufis. They're the ecstatic, intoxicated community. And I'm wondering if we know where the dance came from. Did Shams bring that to Rumi? I read somewhere that Rumi's son actually started it. I'm wondering if you know about the roots of the turn.
Well, there is one way of looking at the micro and the macro. Everything in existence that has a life, and I'm not defining life as the animal, non-animal type, but where there's life, and in Arabic, the word for life, and the word for movement, and the word for wind or breathing, they all have the same cardinal letter in the middle of it. So when you look inside an atom, there is a spinning of the electron, neutrons, and all that. They are dancing. When you look at the cosmos, the Milky Way, when you look at, when I meant the micro and the macro, you could go to the maximum in each direction, and there is that spinning. Part of the Islamic tradition in the Orthodox religious practices, one of them is the pilgrimage in Mecca, which happened to have been last Saturday, I guess.
I was wondering if that would come up. What a different situation this year.
Yeah. So there is a spinning, and in that spinning, just as the one for the dervishes is that you focus on a central point, that black hole I was talking about earlier, at the point of nothingness, which is another, etymologically speaking, the word Allah means the nothingness. So you turn around that nothingness and you spin in a way that your heart is towards it. So you kind of move in a counterclock wise. Sorry, that was a bad sentence. You move in a counterclockwise around that center. That is the black stone in Mecca. And that is what you do for a pilgrimage. What happened in the case of the whirling dervishes, again, Sufi stories are the level of validity, the degree of validity is always questionable. It is said that at a certain point when people were trying to comfort Rumi and tell him that, yeah, well, Shams went and he will come back and, you know, don't worry. And, you know, they were trying to help him through his grieving. He came to a realization that, well, no, not this time. He's not coming back. And he got up and he was kind of grieving and expressing his pain and calling Shams's name, Shams, Ya Shams, Ya Shams. And he started whirling around the pole of the mosque. And as he did this, he felt good about it and he started whirling. And so people tried to accompany him because they were trying to comfort him. And that's how the whirling began. Now, how true that is, I wasn't there. So, but that's one version as how it began.
Selena, I think I had seen that you had something to add. Do you want to jump in with us?
First of all, it was mind-blowing with both of you. It was such a beautiful combination. I want to go at this from a clinical perspective and even a personal perspective. I think that Shams provided what I would call clinically a soul transformation. Without him, Rumi could not have, I mean, the chemistry, whether it was past life or whatever, the chemistry and the power of what happened, you know, was life-changing for both of them. And clinically, that happens when some people need different mentors. I know, Connie, you've seen this in your practice, I'm sure. Some people can take a risk and some people can't, because what's called at that moment is they have to shed their skin and be someone different. Some people are so fearful of doing that, they can't. They become paralyzed. They go into a depression, they become frozen. Other people go with the flow and move into new places. And you just never know who can and who can't. But the importance of mentorship and looking for people that are completely different than yourself, I think is one of the most important things that any one of us can do to change, grow, and expand the capacity of who we think we are. I'm just going to give you a very quick personal example. I was born in northern Canada. I'm a small town farm girl. So I have, you know, a very limited childhood. The population was 900 people. That's an apartment building in LA. So when I met my very first mentor, he was a Chinese acupuncturist, Dr. NG. Now this is over 4 decades ago. And he was amazing. He was doing miracles. He had miracle energy. People would come to him with, you know, they couldn't walk for 10 years and in 6 months they'd be walking. So I sat with him and observed all the things of change that he was doing with all of his clients. And that totally changed and shifted what I thought was possible in the world. And it broke every boundary. And that sort of, without him, I wouldn't be who I am today, because he's the one, and I did not know this when I was 19. I did not know that you could leave your family. And in my early 20s, he said, Selena, you need to leave your family. So when he died, I was ready to leave. I sold my car for $2,000 and I went on the heroine's journey. I moved to Toronto knowing one person, and I left my family behind. So these kinds of things happen. People do this. Not many. I wish more would, because they'd be a lot healthier and they would stop taking all the depression medicine. So I'm going to put this to you, Connie, because I know you've worked with a lot of clients too.
That's a beautiful analogy to the clinical work and your own, you know, it's a Bedristian moment, what you described. It was unexpected and you received it and you allowed it to kind of transmute your cells. That can happen in therapy. It can happen with an archetypal transference, which is very much like a guru transference. And especially if we as clinicians know the right moment when to hand back the power, right? When to return the authority that we've been carrying for the client. Then there's a real alchemical thing that happens there. I mean, in terms of Rumi and Shams, there's been so much controversy about the nature of their connection. And I wanted to say something about that because Dana sent us an email before we started with a question, Zaman, about the nature of Shams. Who was Shams? What do we know about Shams? And you know, what constantly comes up, I haven't been teaching this recently, but in the past when I taught this material, the question I always got was, did Rumi and Shams have a sexual relationship? So we tend in our imaginations, this kind of alchemical bond, to concretize it as sexual. From my point of view, I can't answer that, I wasn't there. But my guess, my intuition tells me no, this was a spiritual kinship, twinship. And there have been arguments, especially in the gay community, people who want to kind of promote that this was a gay relationship. I don't know, but I don't think so. I do want to ask someone, what do we know about Shams historically? When Neil and I were in Turkey, we did a pilgrimage to find his tomb. And we went to several places and nobody really knew where he was buried. So I'm wondering if you must know more than I do about his origins before he was wandering. I mean, I kind of think of him like a sannyasi in India, you know, the wandering mendicants. I kind of think of him like that. Do we know anything about his background or his personal history or his, you said you didn't think he had a traditional education. Do we know anything else?
One thing that's known about him is that in his early childhood, he had an argument with his father. And at one point he told his father very bluntly, he said, "Father, you're a rooster, I'm a duck. I can jump into the water, can you? Leave me alone." So that kind of represents the kind of person he was. He didn't really care much for manners. And that's why he was it was not easy to be around him. And so he went from school to school. I mean, I don't know if they had the word expelled from school. He probably got expelled, you know, tens of times until someone told him, look, if there is anyone who can tolerate, I mean, they probably didn't use the word tolerate. If there's anyone who can stand you, who can accommodate you, would be a certain sheikh in the city of Kerman. Go there. And that was sort of his last hope. So he would have originally been from Tabriz, which is in today's Iran, in the northwest, close to the Turkish border. Kerman, on the other hand, is in the east, close to Afghanistan and Pakistan, again, in today's Iran. So he goes there and he tells that sheikh the same story. He said, I've been sent to you. You're the last resort. I don't have anywhere else to go. This is what I've been told, that only you can help me. So the man says, oh, sure, yeah, please come join the madrasa and do the rest of whatever everyone else was doing. But at the end of the month, the man turns to him and says, look, I tried my best. It just doesn't work for us. So I'm going to send you away with a blessing that the day comes that you find someone who can understand you, who could speak at your level, so you won't be frustrated. And I pray to God that that person will be so much in love with you, will understand you so well, that he can even write his poetry in your name. But please, leave us, sort of. Well, that is the last of his whatever educational training he had. And so when he left, and that's exactly what happened. Rumi named all his Divan-i-Shams, even to this day. People quote from the Divan-i-Shams. It's Divan, I mean, that is the poetry compendium that was not written by Shams. Shams didn't write poetry, Rumi did. But instead of using his pen name, he always used Shams. And so it's called Divan-i-Shams. So I think when you look at it, you would be feeling like here's this frustration, here's this mind that's exploding with ideas. And you would want to share it. You know, like when you have those aha moments within your own life, you can't keep it inside. And this man would have been frustrated with it, knowing all these things. It doesn't matter if it was informal education, but he has to have had a listening ear, someone who would listen to him, not out of politeness, listen to him and understand him. And that's why when I said earlier that he met Rumi at the exact time when Rumi was ready for his next transformation, because he had gotten frustrated with his, and Shams had always been frustrated with his. And so when they talked from that first question, they knew exactly what they were talking about, and nobody could understand it. And they were so thirsty. So Rumi became kind of, can we say, the mouthpiece in a way for Shams. Shams couldn't express himself because he wasn't a teacher, he didn't have the training, and he didn't have, like I say, the etiquette. He would scream and shout and do all kinds of crazy things. He was a type 8 personality. He just didn't have it in him to say it. So what we hear as Rumi's poetry, in a way, is Shams's ideas get transferred to Rumi, and the Rumi becomes the mouthpiece for Shams. And that it's not that Rumi didn't have any of it his own, but from the perspective that he's presenting. And here's one more, for instance, Rumi as a scholar, again, that town square tradition was common there. So one day, Rumi is standing in the street corner, and there are, 10, 20, 30, whatever number of people around him. And Shams appears from a distance, and Shams says, Mawlana, what are you doing? And Mawlana is the word for honorific for Rumi. And Rumi says, well, I'm explaining to these people how to know God. I'm introducing God to them. And Shams says, why don't you introduce yourself to them? So you look at the degree of bluntness, and then you look at the depth of this suggestion. There's no way you can know God unless you yourself know yourself first, because you're the instrument. You're the telescope with which you're viewing God. If the telescope is not adjusted, if it doesn't have the right lens, if it can't cover the right distance, you can look at it all you want to. You're not going to see anything. So that's why it has become a common thing that knowing yourself is knowing God. So these would be the kind of things that it would take one word for Shams to say it, and Rumi will get the whole message, and then he will incorporate it into his poetry.
Volumes.
Yeah, so then just to, Shams he was literally a wanderer because he was really placeless. He just didn't belong anywhere. And his belonging was not necessarily his physical sustenance and all that, because he could go to any Sufi den, to any mosque, someone will feed him, that was fine. It is the thirsting of the idea, for which the idea would explode in his head, and he would need an outlet for it, and there was no one who could understand.
I have a question for you, Zaman. But before I do, I want to thank you both for your contributions. After listening to both of you, I experienced a sense of intellectual and feeling expansion. So you gave me a lot to both feel through and think about. So I very much appreciate it. Zaman, my question for you is that I took note of how you often talked about Rumi, and you connected him to Islam. You made sure that there was this connection to Islam. But there's a scholar named Rosa Ali, and she talked about that there's this contradiction that in America, Rumi is the largest selling poet. However, she argues that the reason for that is that in the American imagination, he gets disarticulated from Islam, right? So much to the point that Coleman Barks, who Connie mentioned earlier, who's a primary translator, argued that the reason why that occurs in America, in the American imagination, is that religion isn't as important as the spiritual. So I wanted to get a sense of what you think about that discussion. Because again, listening to you, it was very clear to me of his kind of connection to Islam. You helped me understand Sufism a little better, that sort of thing. So I'd like to ask that. But before I finish, in terms of Connie's question, there is a book, a definitive biography by Brad Gooch about Rumi's secret. And Gooch apparently is gay himself. And according to his evidence, that there was no sexual relationship, according to him. But that's all he would say, Connie. So I don't know if that helps, but you could read his book because it is supposed to be authoritative. So again, I'd appreciate it, Zaman, if you kind of help me with that and see what you think.
If I can quote Houston Smith through a metaphor of his, comparing religion with spirituality. He's speaking of a wheel with the spokes, that religion is the circumference, whereas spirituality is the center. What religion does is that religions defined themselves, each religion, compared to another, in how different they are. Because if they are not different, they are not definable. So Christianity has to be different from Islam. Islam has to be different from Buddhism, Hinduism, all that, because their existence, their survival is in being different. And therefore, they would emphasize the difference. Mm-hmm. Whereas when it comes to the spirituality, which is the hub, which is the center of this wheel, if they're talking about the one universal divine being, then that one is not necessarily a mathematical one. It's an absolute one, because we can't say the one God of the Jews versus the one God of the Muslims. It has to be one. So they can't afford to be more than one. And so that's why when it comes to spirituality, the spiritual traditions, whether it's Sufism, Zen, Kabbalah, Christian spiritualism, all of that, they don't define themselves in being different. They understand that they are worshiping one God, however they worship it, because they're not tied, the spiritualists, the mystics are not tied to the conventional, traditional ways of worship and all that. And so in that sense, when Rumi is translated both in terms of time, in terms of place, geography, and in terms of culture, Coleman Barks' translation is in a way diluted Rumi. And I'm not saying this in a negative way. He had to think of his American readers. What did they expect to read? And so therefore, if you want the literal translation of Rumi, you would go to someone like Arbery or to Nicholson or some of the other ones. But when you look at the popularity of it, the popularity of none of them reaches the popularity of Coleman Barks. Because Coleman Barks talks to the Americans of the 20th and 21st century, to the young and to the old, to the people with real life, real problems right here, right now. And so therefore it sounds like Rumi understands the problem of Americans of the 20th and 21st century. But the truth is that Coleman Barks is helping it translated, being translated culturally. So it is more receptive in that sense. But there is no question that Rumi was well grounded in Islam, and his spiritual couplets is called the Quran of the non-Arabs. That there are some 2,000 verses of the Quran that are paraphrased or explained in the spiritual couplets. So in a way to compare the Quran with the spiritual couplets would be that Quran is teaching concepts and ideas without really providing a narrative, whereas the spiritual couplets provides plenty of narratives, beautiful stories of animals, birds, humans, everything, and is then contextualizing those Quranic verses that are relevant to that particular context. So there is, for instance, a rabbit and a lion having an argument. Okay, and then you would think that you're reading a children's story, which is very interesting. But then if you're well versed in the Quran, you say like, oh, wait a minute. Here and there, I see verses of the Quran that are, simplified and put in the language of two animals arguing with one another, for instance. So in that sense, it has appealed to the Muslim culture, but since Coleman Barks, it appeals to the Western culture too.
You know, Boris, it reminds me of transcendental meditation that was completely stripped of its Hindu cultural roots. And mindfulness now, mindfulness is not even taught as Buddhist practice in some places. I think there's a loss in that disconnect, but there's also a gain in its more widespread accessibility. You know, I sent Coleman an early draft of my novel, and he loved it and said he wanted to provide the poetry. And then when the novel was finished, I sent it to him, and he said, "You've completely betrayed me." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Shams wasn't like this. Shams was a superhero. He didn't have any shadow stuff.
Oh, oh yeah.
And he said, I can't give you my poetry. So I think that, you know, we all, I think I'm telling that story because he gave us the great, Coleman Barks gave us an incredible gift. But at the same time, he got fundamentalist in his own way, right? Even though he's not fundamentalist in a religious way, he got fundamentalist about Rumi and Shams and who they were, you know. The other thing I want to say was that when I was studying Sufism, we went to both teachers of Rumi's lineage. We also went to Kabir Helminski. They are really rooted in Islam. I mean, those teachers are not saying this is Rumi's Sufism and it's separate from Islam. I mean, the Americans who are taking on those lineages are living Islam.
If I can add one more thing, I think there is this traditional adversarial competition between the East and the West. Remember, there were the Greeks and the Persians.
That's right.
It might have been political, it might have been religious. Then it came down through centuries. Somehow, this part of the world, the East and the West would have to think different somehow. So it just happens that that a religion became part of it. So it's these sensitivities that are more cultural. And so when we say Rumi is like a Muslim, because we have this whole cultural baggage of resentment of the Muslims, then we say, no, well, how could it be if this thing that we resent so much presents something so beautiful? Because we can't, what's the correct word? We can't separate the two together. And the same thing goes in from the Eastern culture. I have a wonderful friend, a blonde, blue-eyed American who's a Muslim. And I met him in an Islamic conference. And then there were these cultural Muslims from the Indian subcontinent and Arabs and others. They were looking at this man like, I mean, what is he doing here?
Yeah.
Because he didn't look like them. So we often look at the outer garment, the appearance, and how we stereotype people culturally. And with that culture comes certain other things, including your religious identities. And so it is kind of the clash of identities. And maybe that's why when I gave you the analogy earlier, that the wheel,
right.
If we try to get away from religions who have everything to do in separating us, to come to spirituality who has no other choice but to unite us in it.
Yeah.
I think that's the path. But the problem is that more than 90% of every religious community, and I mean religious identity, they are thinking in the conventional religious ways, which is always opting for separation, for difference, for resentment, for adversarial type of relationship.
Yeah, yes, you make a very good point. And even the Latin version of religion, religiare, one manifestation of that is to bind rather than to separate. So I think you're right about that. And thank you both. I really appreciate your responses. I got a lot of them both. Thank you.
So interesting to think about the word science having the root word to divide in that context. Anyway, Dana.
Well, Zaman, I think how different everything would be if I hadn't ventured over to UCLA about 20 some odd years ago to attend a class that you were teaching on Rumi. I think of how many times you've been in my life over these past two plus decades, how gracious you've been to show up, talk. When I introduced you to Patrick Mahaffey, he saw the gift that you have, and you've been at Pacifica ever since. I think that we often do not fully take account of the virtue or value of these interruptions in our life, these things that come in out of seemingly nowhere, and then they become life transforming. I look at Rumi and Shams. Shams was only in his life for 2 or 3 years. And yet Rumi without that, would have been just another upper middle class Afghan. So I think that we want to see ourselves as receptors to the consequences of these things that we can't plan, these interruptions, these collisions with uncertainty, with the unconscious. Because I think those are the guests outside our door knocking, because, you know, they're coming in, and be careful and invite them in, because that's the divine. Those are the voices of the divine. In my life, you are a voice of the divine. And for whether it's classes or parties or dinners, and without violating your space, I would like to invoke Jahan, you know, your beloved. I'm gonna tear up. You both were very, very dear to me and Michelle. And you're just the most gracious individual, and you've shown up today, and you have really blessed us, as Connie has. But even Connie wouldn't be here if I hadn't perhaps met you, you know?
I'm simply reflecting. I'm reflecting your graciousness, and I think in a way things were meant to be the way they were. I wasn't planning on any of that. I took my resume to UCLA. I was supposed to be teaching history, and the person who was reading it and said like, "Oh, what is this?" And I said, "Oh my God, I was so careful in typing my resume correctly. I must have made a mistake." And she said, no, what is this word? And I got closer and I said, "Oh, that is Rumi." And so I got, it was a sigh of relief. I said, "It's not a typo or anything." So she says, "What is Rumi?" She read the paragraph and asked me the question. So I explained to her what Rumi was. So she said, "Can you teach this?" And I said, "Well, but I'm applying for the history class." She said, no, don't worry about that. We'll find someone for that. Can you teach this? And I was kind of, no, I wasn't hesitant. I couldn't believe it, that, you know, something I would love to do. And so I said, yes. So she said, "Okay, forget it. You're hired. Go get your syllabus ready." And then I have the syllabus ready. And I come to class, and you and Michelle are sitting right there in the front row. So I knew that, well, yeah, these other students are interested, but these two lovebirds that you are, that there's something going on, until the day came when you said, "Well, you don't belong there," which was a good way of putting it too. And then the Patrick call, and the rest of it is, as they say, is history, and I think a little bit of geography too. But I appreciate your friendship tremendously, and it's been wonderful.
Well, you know, in one of the religious traditions that I was raised in, but they raised me, and I'm a child of exploration, says that accidents are unknown to God. And so what we have is a delicious synchronicity. And we keep moving through these, and hopefully in the Myth Salon, we uncover some of these synchronicities. In fact, we were talking with a fellow named Rob Hopke, who has a book called Synchronicities, and he has agreed to come join us. I think it's October 25th, if I recall right, but I'm not sure. I don't have my calendar in front of me.
Yeah.
But what are the, I mean, if I had not listened to my good friend Dara Marks and gone down and visited this young fellow named Will Lynn downtown in a building that I absolutely don't like going downtown, but I will go for him. And he said, yes. Well, what if Shams had, what if Shams, in interrupting the journey or the horse ride of Rumi, what if he'd gone on another street or he had not done it? I mean, these are coincidences that are deeply meaningful, that we have to recognize the potential of the world to talk to us in a language. It's the only way it knows how. We can't solve our life's journey through the processes of reason.
I know I remember Will's first day too. I don't know if you're, I'm sure he remembers it too. It was the orientation, and after some of the profs did their whatever talk and all that, they turned to the students to introduce themselves and say a few things, especially to the new ones. And way back there on the left side in the South Hall is this little kid who got up and he started talking. And I think at least half of the hall couldn't hold their laughter back, because they thought, like, there is this little kid, what is he doing with mythologies? And they thought he must have memorized the things that he is saying, because his wordings came so mature, yet his age was, I mean, he was very, very young. So when they waited for a few seconds, they said, like, wait a minute, I think he means what he says, and what he says makes sense. And so everybody kind of looked around. They said, we want to look at where this voice comes from. And so he was impressive from that very first day of the orientation in South Hall. I'm sure he remembers.
I can't believe you remember that. I'm so flattered.
I learn from him every time he opens his mouth. So we've overrun our time by a couple minutes, but I think we're in good shape. What a delightful, delightful afternoon. At the risk of changing the direction too much, I would like to say that the silence that we're going to invoke as we unravel the ritual of the Myth Salon is really the same silence that wraps itself around the still point. And the still point is something that, to rip the phrase from my good friend Joe Bograd, it's cultivating the still point. And it's something that we could do more of. We could do with more receptive listening, with more just invoking silence. So the tool of silence is noise.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Zaman. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Voris.
Thank you. Wonderful evening. Thank you.
Beautiful presentation. Thank you all very much.